So there I was, diesel fumes still hanging in the air from my 200-mile drive, when this woman, in a neon green tracksuit, clicks across my driveway in designer heels and slaps a $500 fine on my windshield like she's serving a court summons. Apparently my U-Haul was disrupting the aesthetic harmony of Willowbrook Estates. I'm Marcus, and I hadn't even turned off my engine when this HOA president, we'll call her Deirdre because, well, that's her name, whips out a stack of pre-printed violations thicker than a phone book. 14 infractions total. Mailbox height, grass length, doormat color. Hell, she probably would have cited me for breathing too loudly if she could find the right covenant. Standing there reeking of cheap perfume and entitlement, she explains I've got 48 hours to pay $2,100 or face foreclosure. But here's what made me smile. Deirdre had absolutely no clue she'd just picked a fight with the guy who collects her rent. What would you do if some HOA tyrant ambushed you before you unpacked your toothbrush? Where are you watching from? And what's your wildest HOA horror story? Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mess. 3 months earlier, I was living in Phoenix, managing commercial properties for a company that decided my entire department was redundant. 20 years of keeping their buildings profitable, and they gave me a cardboard box and a security escort. The cherry on top? My ex-wife chose that exact moment to inform me she was keeping the house and moving in with her yoga instructor, a guy named Moonbeam who sells crystals at farmers markets. So when Great-Aunt Millicent's lawyer called to say she'd left me her place in Colorado, it felt like a lifeline. Millicent was my grandmother's sister, this tiny woman who could rebuild a transmission and organize a church bake sale in the same weekend. After Uncle Frank died in Vietnam, she raised 3 kids alone, worked double shifts at the diner, and somehow still found time to feed every stray cat in a 5-block radius. Here's what I learned in property management. Always read the fine print, especially when dealing with homeowners associations. HOAs are basically mini governments with all the corruption potential but none of the oversight. Knowledge nugget. HOA boards have fiduciary duties just like corporate directors, which means they can be personally liable for financial mismanagement. Keep that in mind. It'll matter later. The house sits on a corner lot in Willowbrook Estates, a 47-home subdivision that started middle class in 1979, but got all bougie over the years. Now it's the kind of place where people drive luxury cars but still argue over splitting dinner checks. Monthly HOA fees had somehow ballooned to $180, supposedly covering landscaping, pool maintenance, and community standards enforcement, which sounds about as ominous as it actually is. I should have known something was rotten when the lawyer mentioned Millicent had some ongoing disputes with the homeowners association. But honestly, I figured it was typical elderly person stuff. Maybe she planted peonies instead of petunias or committed the cardinal sin of having a garden gnome. Sweet summer child that I was. So there I am, August heat making the asphalt smell like a tire fire, when Deirdre Pickering emerges from her pristine white BMW like some suburban Terminator. This woman is peak HOA Karen, the kind who peaked as homecoming queen in 1987 and has been trying to reclaim that authority ever since. Her athleisure outfit costs more than most people's car payments, and she's got this professional camera hanging around her neck like she's documenting war crimes instead of mailbox violations. She starts circling my truck with predatory precision, that camera clicking faster than a Geiger counter near Chernobyl. The sound made my molars ache. Then she produces these pre-printed violation notices. We're talking professional cardstock with embossed letterhead and my name already filled in fancy calligraphy. This wasn't spontaneous tyranny. This was premeditated bureaucratic warfare. Commercial vehicles are strictly prohibited in residential zones, she announces, pointing at the faded company decals on my F-150. Never mind that it's my personal truck. Apparently having Phoenix Property Solutions on the door makes you an environmental hazard. Unapproved landscaping modifications detected, she continues, gesturing dramatically at Great-Aunt Millicent's rose bushes. These gorgeous pink climbers that had been blooming there since Carter was president were suddenly criminal because nobody had submitted Form 27B to the Sacred Committee of Aesthetic Purity. Mailbox exhibits paint degradation exceeding community standards. I swear she actually said paint degradation like she was diagnosing terminal cancer. The mailbox had maybe 3 chips, barely visible unless you were actively hunting for flaws. But here's what really caught my attention. While she's performing this theatrical inspection, I notice neighbors watching from behind curtains like they're witnessing a mob hit. These aren't curious observers. These people look genuinely terrified. An elderly woman across the street slammed her blinds shut when Deirdre glanced over. A guy washing his car suddenly discovered his tire pressure needed urgent attention. That's when Deirdre delivers the kill shot. The previous owner also experienced compliance challenges before her unfortunate passing. The way she said "unfortunate" made my blood run cold, like Millicent's death was just another item on her efficiency checklist. I kept my cool, asked to see the HOA covenants and financial records. You'd have thought I requested her browser history and bank statements. Suddenly, everything was confidential documentation, requiring formal procedures and board authorization. When I casually mentioned my background in commercial property management, her mask slipped. The saccharine smile flickered, revealing something predatory underneath. She promised appropriate enforcement measures and clicked away, leaving me with $2,100 in bogus fines and the distinct impression I'd just been marked for execution. But here's the thing Deirdre didn't know. I don't just manage properties, I own them, including, as it turns out, the one she calls home. The next morning, I wake up to find a certified letter wedged in my door like a mob hit contract. Deirdre had escalated overnight. We're talking professional-grade psychological warfare that would make a Pentagon strategist jealous. This wasn't just a violation notice. This was a full legal assault wrapped in HOA letterhead and sealed with the kind of bureaucratic malice that could power a small dictatorship. The letter demanded immediate payment of all fines, now mysteriously inflated to $2,087 thanks to administrative processing fees and late penalties that had apparently multiplied like rabbits while I slept. She'd included time-stamped photos from every conceivable angle, professional documentation that would make CSI investigators weep with envy, and threats of lien placement within 30 days. This woman had CC'd everyone from the community management company to some lawyer whose name sounded like he specialized in foreclosing on orphanages. But here's where Deirdre made her first tactical error. She assumed I was just another intimidated homeowner who'd roll over faster than a golden retriever. What she didn't realize is that 20 years managing commercial properties teaches you one crucial survival skill: how to read the fine print that everyone else treats like terms and conditions on a software update. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. If you've never experienced this particular slice of bureaucratic hell, picture the DMV's uglier cousin: fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like extras from a zombie movie, the musty smell of old paper mixed with broken dreams, and clerks who act like you're personally responsible for every filing cabinet in the building. But county records are public records, which means Deirdre's little kingdom had to play by actual rules instead of whatever she scribbled on napkins during her wine nights. What I found there was juicier than a reality TV show scandal. The original 1983 HOA covenants bore about as much resemblance to Deirdre's current rules as a bicycle does to a fighter jet. The original document was maybe 12 pages of common-sense neighbor guidelines. Keep your yard decent, don't paint your house like a carnival tent, don't use your driveway as a used car lot. But somehow, over the years, this reasonable document had mutated into a 47-page totalitarian manifesto covering everything from approved seasonal decorations to acceptable pet walking routes. I remembered reading somewhere that most HOA rule changes require actual homeowner votes, and if those votes never happened, the new rules carry about as much legal weight as a chocolate teapot. Even better, Great Aunt Millicent's property had special grandfathered status for landscaping. Those rose bushes Deirdre was having conniptions about, they were specifically protected under the original covenant as existing mature plantings. Her violation notice was about as legally binding as a grocery list. But the real treasure was buried in the HOA financial records. As a property owner, I had every right to see them, and what I found made my commercial property manager brain start calculating faster than a NASA computer. Numbers that didn't add up, expenses that seemed more inflated than a Macy's parade float, and a budget that looked like it was designed by someone who learned accounting from fortune cookies. That's when Gladys materialized, and I mean materialized like some kind of neighborhood intelligence fairy godmother. This 78-year-old retired librarian had been watching me from across the street and apparently decided I looked trustworthy enough for some serious neighborhood intel. "You're asking questions about the HOA," she whispered. glancing around like we were planning to break someone out of Alcatraz. Good. Someone needs to. The folder Gladys handed me was thick enough to stop small-caliber bullets. She'd been documenting Deirdre's reign of terror with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 40 years organizing information for a living. 12 families targeted in 2 years, all following the same playbook: excessive fines, impossible deadlines, forced sales below market value. And whose real estate company kept scoring those listings? 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. 3 elderly residents had already been steamrolled out of their homes. Mrs. Olivia got nailed for a mailbox post that leaned maybe 2 degrees off vertical. The Rodriguez family was cited for excessive children's toys because their kids had the audacity to leave a bicycle visible from the street. Mr. Patterson, a Korean War veteran, got fined because his American flag was allegedly improperly proportioned for his flagpole. That afternoon, Deirdre returned with backup. Her boyfriend, Chad, sporting some kind of fake security badge he'd probably ordered from the same place mall cops get their uniforms. They demanded entry to inspect for interior covenant violations, which was apparently a thing in Deirdre's imaginary legal universe. I politely declined, mentioning little details like the Fourth Amendment and basic property rights. Chad started photographing through my windows like some discount private investigator, which is when I decided to drop my first breadcrumb. "Funny thing," I said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "The HOA budget shows $40,000 in landscaping expenses, but the actual contractor only received $15,000. Makes you wonder where that other $25,000 ended up." The silence was so complete you could have heard a dust mite sneeze. Deirdre cycled through more colors than a neon sign having an electrical malfunction, and Chad suddenly remembered he had urgent business elsewhere. They retreated to their BMW faster than vampires fleeing sunlight, but not before Deirdre promised serious legal consequences for my harassment and intimidation. I just smiled and gave them a friendly wave. After all, I was just getting warmed up. Deirdre's response to my little accounting question was swift and about as subtle as a brick through a window. The next morning, I'm enjoying my coffee and watching the sunrise when a city code enforcement truck pulls up. Out steps this apologetic inspector who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. "Got a complaint about an abandoned commercial vehicle," he says, checking his clipboard with the enthusiasm of someone reading his own obituary. He walks around my perfectly legal F-150, finds absolutely nothing wrong, and apologizes for wasting both our time. But before he leaves, he leans in close. "Anonymous tip came in at 6 a.m. Caller knew your exact address and truck description. Real specific for someone just driving by." 2 hours later, I get a call from the state contractor's licensing board. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint claiming I was operating an unlicensed business out of my residence. The investigator was professional but had to ask, was I running Phoenix Property Solutions from my Colorado address? I explained that I'd moved, wasn't operating any business, and the decals were just left over from my previous job. Case closed in 5 minutes, but the message was crystal clear. Deirdre was playing hardball. That night, around 2 a.m., I hear footsteps on gravel outside. Living alone makes you develop pretty good hearing for things that don't belong, and these definitely didn't belong. I peek through the blinds just in time to see a white BMW creeping past like some suburban stalker mobile. The next morning, I find my mailbox decorated with spray paint. Nothing obscene, just random squiggles designed to create another violation. There's also a lovely pile of dog waste on my front porch, positioned with the kind of precision that suggests this wasn't some random mutt expressing artistic freedom. Good thing I'd installed security cameras the day before. You learn to be paranoid in property management. Too many tenants who think security deposits are suggestions rather than requirements. The footage was beautiful. Deirdre's BMW circling at 2:17 a.m., clear shots of her license plate, and Chad skulking around my property like the world's least competent ninja. But while Deirdre was playing amateur vandal, I was diving deeper into the HOA's financial rabbit hole. And what I found down there was more twisted than a pretzel factory explosion. Remember how I mentioned the landscaping discrepancy? That was just the appetizer. The pool cleaning contract was the real masterpiece. $800 a month for a community pool that's maybe 30 feet long and sees about as much use as a snowball in Phoenix. I called around and got quotes from actual pool services. Market rate was closer to $200, but Elite Pool Services was apparently worth quadruple the going rate, despite the fact that the pool looked like a science experiment gone wrong. Green water, leaves floating like lily pads, and a smell that suggested something had died in there during the Clinton administration. The landscaping contract was even better, $3,000 a month for comprehensive grounds maintenance that consisted of mowing 47 tiny front yards and trimming some hedges. I've managed shopping centers with less maintenance budget, but Mountain View Landscaping was clearly providing premium services if you counted showing up twice a month and running a mower for an hour as premium. Then there were the legal fees, $15,000 a year for routine compliance enforcement. Most HOAs spend maybe $2,000 annually on legal stuff, and that's when they're actually dealing with serious problems. But apparently, enforcing mailbox height regulations required the kind of legal firepower usually reserved for corporate mergers. My investigation was starting to attract some neighborhood allies. Bob, a Vietnam vet with hands that looked like they'd rebuilt half the machines in America, knocked on my door one evening with a beer and some interesting observations. Sophia, a single mom who worked as a paralegal, offered to help with legal research. Even Pastor Williams from the nearby church stopped by to express support. Apparently, Deirdre had tried to get the church cited for excessive parking during Sunday services. But Deirdre wasn't done with her amateur hour intimidation campaign. She filed a police report claiming I'd aggressively confronted her and made threatening statements about her finances. Officer Rodriguez showed up looking like he'd rather be chasing actual criminals. Took one look at my security footage and quickly realized he was dealing with a bogus complaint. "Word of advice," he said quietly as he was leaving. "Document everything. I've seen this pattern before, and it usually gets worse before it gets better." That's when Deirdre made her biggest mistake yet. She actually demanded that Officer Rodriguez arrest me for disturbing the peace and intimidating a public official. Apparently, being an HOA president now qualified as public service. The officer's response was professional but firm. "Ma'am, asking questions about HOA finances isn't a crime. Making false police reports, however, is." As Rodriguez drove away and Deirdre stomped back to her BMW, I realized something important. I wasn't just dealing with a petty tyrant anymore. I was dealing with someone who was genuinely desperate. People don't escalate this quickly unless they have something serious to hide. And hiding in Great Aunt Millicent's attic, I was about to discover exactly what that something was. Deirdre's desperation hit full throttle when she called an emergency HOA board meeting with exactly 24 hours notice, which, as it turns out, violates the bylaws that require 72 hours minimum. But desperate people don't read fine print. They just bulldoze ahead and hope nobody notices their legal train wreck. The meeting was held in Deirdre's living room, which immediately felt like being summoned to the principal's office, except the principal was wearing yoga pants and reeked of vanilla candles. She'd arranged the furniture like a courtroom, with herself behind this massive oak desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. The agenda, printed on her real estate company letterhead, had exactly one item: emergency foreclosure proceedings against 1247 Maple Street. Only 3 of the 5 board members showed up. Apparently, the other 2 had suddenly developed mysterious scheduling conflicts. Without a quorum, they couldn't legally vote on anything more consequential than what flavor of donuts to serve. But Deirdre plowed ahead anyway, like a freight train with broken brakes. That's when Gladys appeared in the doorway like some avenging librarian angel. This woman who'd been terrorized into submission for months suddenly found her voice and started citing Robert's Rules of Order like she was reading poetry. "Point of order. You cannot conduct official business without a quorum. This meeting is procedurally invalid." Deirdre's mask finally slipped completely. She screamed at Gladys, actually screamed, calling her a meddling old busybody and threatening to fine her for disrupting official proceedings. The transformation was spectacular, suburban princess to raging tyrant in about 3 seconds flat. While Deirdre was having her public meltdown, I'd been having my own private breakthrough. Sophia's paralegal skills had uncovered something that made my property management experience tingle with recognition. Shell company connections that were more tangled than Christmas lights in a tornado. Mountain View Landscaping wasn't just some random contractor. It was owned by Deirdre's nephew, a 23-year-old kid whose previous employment experience consisted of working at GameStop and getting fired from a pizza delivery job. Elite Pool Services belonged to Chad, who apparently learned pool maintenance from YouTube videos and Optimism. And Legal Solutions LLC, that was Deirdre's college roommate's law firm, specializing in what I'm generously calling creative interpretations of HOA law. Every single vendor was connected to Deirdre's family or social circle, all charging rates that would make luxury resorts blush. I'd seen this exact scam in commercial properties, board members steering contracts to friends and family while skimming profits like they're running some kind of suburban crime syndicate. But the real smoking gun came when I started comparing violation patterns across the neighborhood. Remember how I mentioned Deirdre's selective enforcement? It wasn't random, it was surgical. She systematically targeted elderly residents, single parents, and anyone who looked like they might struggle to fight back. The Hendersons got cited for having a non-regulation garden gnome, while the McMansion 3 houses down had actual code violations that never appeared on any inspection report. My informal coffee meetings at Rosie's Diner were turning into underground resistance gatherings. 23 residents showed up to the latest one, sharing horror stories that painted a picture of systematic harassment. Mrs. Patterson described how Deirdre had fined her for excessive memorial decorations after she put up a small flag for her late husband's military service. The Johnsons got cited for their kids' chalk drawings on their own driveway, lasting more than acceptable temporary duration. Apparently, children's art was now a covenant violation. Bob's engineering assessment of the community infrastructure was the final nail in Deirdre's coffin. This man had built bridges in Vietnam and maintained factory equipment for 40 years, so when he said something was wrong, you listened. His report read like a forensic accounting nightmare. Thousands of dollars charged for road repairs that never happened, drainage work that existed only on paper, and a security system that consisted of exactly one broken camera pointed at a tree. That's when Deirdre went nuclear. She hired a private investigator, probably someone from the same discount detective agency where Chad got his fake badge, to dig up dirt on my background. The rumors started flying faster than gossip at a church potluck. My military discharge was supposedly dishonorable. It wasn't. I was gang-affiliated because I'd lived in Phoenix. Apparently every Arizona resident is automatically suspect. And my great-aunt had left me the house because I was blackmailing her, which would be impressive considering she'd been dead when I allegedly started. The racial undertones weren't subtle. Deirdre was playing on every suburban fear she could think of, painting me as some kind of outside agitator come to destroy their precious community. She created fake social media accounts to spread these lies, because nothing says credible neighborhood leader like anonymous internet trolling. But while she was busy constructing her house of lies, I was building my house of evidence. Every meeting, every violation, every suspicious financial transaction was documented with the kind of obsessive detail that would make an FBI forensic accountant weep with joy. Then Deirdre played her final, desperate card, a certified letter claiming I owed $47,000 in special assessments for improvements that included a new playground, upgraded security system, and road repairs. None of these improvements actually existed, but the payment was due in 10 days or my property would be liened. I read that letter twice, then started laughing. Deirdre had just handed me exactly the kind of overreach I'd been waiting for. Time to show her what happens when you pick a fight with someone who actually knows how to read a contract. The court-ordered financial records arrived on a Thursday morning that smelled like rain and revolution. My attorney had worked some legal magic, and suddenly Deirdre's carefully guarded secrets were spread across my dining room table like evidence from a crime scene. What I found there made 20 years of property management fraud cases look like amateur hour at a community theater. Over $300,000 had vanished from HOA accounts through an elaborate shell game that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. Deirdre hadn't just been skimming, she'd been running a full-scale money laundering operation disguised as community improvement. Fake, emergency assessments for work that existed only in her imagination, invoices for materials that were never delivered, and payments to contractors who turned out to be her relatives with newly minted business licenses. But the real kicker was hiding in the property title research. My attorney's office had been thorough, and buried in the mineral rights documentation was a detail that made my coffee taste like victory. Great-Aunt Millicent's property included a small natural gas deposit. Nothing huge, but enough that Rocky Mountain Energy had been paying royalties for 3 years. Royalties that should have been going to the property owner. Royalties that had instead been flowing into the HOA's general fund, with Deirdre as the sole signatory. $18,000 of my money, collected and spent without my knowledge or consent. That single fact gave me legal standing to demand a complete forensic audit of every HOA transaction going back to when Deirdre took power. The safety deposit box key had been hiding in plain sight, tucked inside Great Aunt Millicent's ancient recipe box between instructions for apple pie and pot roast. The box itself contained 5 years of meticulous documentation that would have made a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Audio recordings of Deirdre admitting to creative accounting and working around those ridiculous financial rules. Copies of forged homeowner signature pages on covenant amendments that were never actually voted on. Bank statements showing systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. But the final document hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Great Aunt Millicent's last letter, written in her careful handwriting just 2 weeks before she died. Marcus, if you're reading this, then Deirdre Pickering has probably tried to destroy what's left of our community. I've gathered everything I could, but I'm too old and tired to fight this battle. Maybe you aren't. The evidence is all here. Make them pay for what they've done to our neighbors. Suddenly, Great Aunt Millicent's heart attack didn't seem so random. Her doctor's records, which I'd subpoenaed as part of the property inheritance, showed dangerously elevated blood pressure starting exactly when Deirdre's harassment campaign began. The stress of fighting this corruption had literally killed her, and Deirdre had probably celebrated when her biggest obstacle conveniently died. My motivation shifted from personal defense to something much deeper. This wasn't about mailbox heights or lawn violations anymore. This was about honoring the memory of a woman who'd spent her final months trying to protect her neighbors from a predator. The evidence added up to multiple federal crimes: mail fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement on a scale that would trigger FBI interest. Her real estate license violations were documented in excruciating detail. The total theft approached $450,000 when you included inflated contracts, fake assessments, and stolen royalty payments. But the beautiful part was that Deirdre had no idea how much evidence existed. She thought she was dealing with one angry homeowner asking inconvenient questions. She had no clue that Great Aunt Millicent had spent years building an ironclad case against her, or that I now held every piece of that puzzle. The annual HOA meeting was mandatory by law and couldn't be canceled once proper notice was given. 67% of homeowners had to attend for major votes, which meant I needed 32 people in that room. Based on my coffee shop intelligence network, I had commitments from 31 households and counting. Deirdre was about to discover that her reign of terror was over. She just didn't know it yet. Great Aunt Millicent's dining room transformed into something between a war room and a FBI field office. I'd pushed her antique table against the wall and covered it with bankers' boxes, legal documents, and a timeline that looked like something from a conspiracy thriller. Red string-connected photographs, financial records, and violation notices in a web that would have made a detective jealous. Gladys had appointed herself my chief intelligence officer, bringing homemade cookies and 40 years of librarian organizational skills to the chaos. Sophia turned out to be a legal research goddess disguised as a paralegal. She'd spent her evenings at the law library, emerging with case precedents and procedural knowledge that my attorney admitted was better than most lawyers could produce. Her dining table was covered with color-coded folders: criminal violations in red, civil damages in blue, procedural violations in yellow. It looked like a rainbow of justice. Building the legal team felt like assembling the Avengers, if the Avengers specialized in HOA fraud instead of fighting aliens. Jennifer Olivia was my primary attorney, 15 years of HOA law experience and a reputation for making corrupt board members cry in depositions. The forensic accountant she recommended could trace money through more shell companies than a Russian oligarch's tax return. We also had a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes and a media consultant who used to produce investigative news segments before going freelance. The state consumer protection attorney offered pro bono support, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they took HOA fraud. When the government lawyers start volunteering their time, you know you've stumbled onto something bigger than petty neighborhood disputes. Community organizing turned into a grassroots movement that would have made a political campaign manager proud. I went door to door like I was running for mayor, explaining residents' rights and sharing what I'd discovered about Deirdre's financial shell game. The WhatsApp group Sophia created grew from 5 people to 37 in 2 weeks, with neighbors sharing evidence photos and supporting each other through decades of accumulated fear. Pastor Williams offered his church basement for strategy meetings, which gave our rebellion a moral authority that Deirdre couldn't touch. Bob brought his engineering expertise and started documenting every infrastructure lie Deirdre had told. His assessment read like an indictment: claimed road repairs that never happened, drainage work that existed only on invoices, and a security system that consisted of one broken camera pointed at a maple tree. The forensic accountant's investigation was surgical precision applied to financial chaos. Every suspicious transaction got traced through bank records that we'd subpoenaed through the Attorney General's office. The pattern was beautiful in its simplicity. Fake invoices led to inflated payments, which flowed through family-owned shell companies before landing in accounts controlled by Deirdre and her inner circle. The visual presentation he created looked like a flowchart for organized crime, which wasn't far from the truth. Sophia prepared enough legal documentation to choke a courthouse, cease and desist orders for harassment, injunction paperwork to freeze HOA accounts, criminal referral packets for multiple agencies, and a class action framework for affected residents. She'd also drafted a homeowner petition to remove Deirdre from the board, citing financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. My media strategy centered around Sarah Mitchell, a local newspaper reporter who specialized in government corruption stories. She'd been investigating HOA abuse across Colorado and jumped on our story like an investigative journalist Christmas morning. The Denver TV affiliate showed interest too, especially after I mentioned the scale of financial fraud and the elderly victims who'd been forced from their homes. The evidence package grew to 847 pages of financial documents, audio recordings, video evidence, and victim testimony. I'd learned from my commercial property days that judges love visual aids, so we created before and after photos showing promised improvements versus actual conditions. The contrast was devastating. Invoices for a playground that didn't exist, bills for road work that was never done, payments for landscaping that looked like it was maintained by blind people with broken lawnmowers. I practiced my presentation with the community theater group that met at Pastor Williams's church, because nothing prepares you for a hostile audience like amateur actors critiquing your delivery. They helped me anticipate Deirdre's likely responses and develop counter-arguments that would work in front of cameras and legal observers. The technical knowledge I'd share with other homeowners got compiled into a handbook that Sophia designed. HOA Rights and Remedies. Basic stuff about demanding financial transparency, challenging discriminatory enforcement, and recognizing the red flags of board corruption. Most people don't realize that HOA boards have the same fiduciary duties as corporate directors, which means personal liability for financial mismanagement. I remembered reading about a case in Texas where board members had to pay restitution from their personal assets after a forensic audit revealed systematic theft. The community center reservation was confirmed for the annual meeting with professional recording equipment and legal observers from the Attorney General's office. We'd even arranged for media attendance because nothing keeps people honest like knowing their behavior might end up on the evening news. As I sat in Great Aunt Millicent's kitchen the night before the confrontation, surrounded by evidence of corruption and community support, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my military days: the calm confidence that comes from thorough preparation and righteous purpose. Deirdre had no idea what was about to hit her. Deirdre's reaction to discovering my growing coalition was like watching a cornered animal realize the trap was closing. The neighborhood gossip network, more efficient than any intelligence agency, had apparently informed her that residents were organizing, and her response was to go completely unhinged. First, she tried to cancel the annual meeting, claiming security concerns and potential violence from outside agitators. The irony was beautiful. The woman who'd been terrorizing elderly neighbors for years was suddenly worried about her own safety. But Colorado state law is pretty clear about mandatory HOA meetings. Once proper notice is sent, you can't just decide democracy is inconvenient and call the whole thing off. She hired a security company to intimidate residents, which backfired spectacularly when the security manager realized what he was being asked to do. Turns out that professional security guards don't appreciate being used as thugs in suburban HOA disputes, especially when the person hiring them can't provide a coherent explanation of what threats they're supposed to be protecting against. The rumors Deirdre started spreading would have been hilarious if they weren't so desperate. According to the Deirdre Pickering Disinformation Network, I was planning a violent confrontation that would destroy property values and bring dangerous elements into the community. She apparently told Mrs. Rodriguez that I was organizing a gang takeover of the neighborhood, which would have been news to the gang of retired librarians, church volunteers, and military veterans who made up my coalition. Meanwhile, her financial desperation was reaching critical mass. She'd attempted to withdraw the remaining $89,000 from HOA accounts, but the bank had frozen everything pending the Attorney General's investigation. When that failed, she tried to destroy financial records, which added obstruction of justice to her growing list of federal crimes. She even attempted to bribe the forensic accountant with real estate commissions, apparently not realizing that offering financial incentives to an expert witness in an ongoing investigation is exactly the kind of thing that lands people in federal prison. The personal attacks escalated to stalking behavior that would have made an obsessed ex-boyfriend proud. Fake reviews appeared on every professional website I'd ever been associated with, claiming I was violent, unstable, and threatening to peaceful residents. She tried to get my truck registration suspended by filing false DMV reports about unsafe vehicle modifications that existed only in her imagination. Chad started following me to job interviews, because apparently unemployed property managers are still enough of a threat to require surveillance. Having your HOA president's boyfriend lurking in parking lots while you're trying to rebuild your career adds a special flavor of harassment that I wouldn't recommend to anyone. But the real escalation came when Deirdre showed up at the grocery store where I was shopping, positioning herself at the end of every aisle like some kind of suburban secret agent. When I finally confronted her about it, she claimed she was monitoring potential threats to community safety. The grocery store manager, bless him, informed her that following customers around his store was called stalking, and she needed to leave immediately. The violation notices she sent to coalition members were masterpieces of petty tyranny. Gladys got cited for having excessive bird feeding activity that was allegedly attracting undesirable wildlife to the community. Sophia received a violation for her children's bicycles being improperly stored in her own garage. Bob's military flag got written up for displaying unauthorized colors during non-federal holidays. The elderly residents started receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours with whispered threats about what would happen to troublemakers who didn't mind their own business. When Gladys's car windshield mysteriously developed a spiderweb crack overnight, the message was clear. Deirdre was willing to escalate to property damage to maintain control. Sophia found dead flowers on her doorstep with a note that read, "Mind your own business or this could be you." The subtlety of a brick through a window, but with the cowardice of anonymous threats. When we filed a police report, Officer Rodriguez just shook his head and added it to what he called the Pickering file. Apparently, we weren't her first victims. But while Deirdre was busy playing suburban terrorist, I was documenting everything for additional criminal charges. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every attempt at intimidation was recorded, photographed, and filed with law enforcement. Her lawyer, the college roommate who'd been enabling this behavior for years, suddenly withdrew from the case when she realized the criminal liability exposure was too great for a civil attorney to handle. The new lawyer immediately tried to negotiate a plea deal through the prosecutor, offering partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. I refused any settlement that didn't include full restitution and criminal prosecution. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice for Great Aunt Millicent and protection for every future resident who might face Deirdre's abuse. The community rallied in ways that restored my faith in human nature. Yard signs appeared overnight reading, "Transparency in HOA Management." Local business owners offered support and alternative meeting venues. A retired cop volunteered security expertise for the upcoming confrontation. As the annual meeting approached, Deirdre's desperation reached nuclear levels. But every desperate move she made only strengthened our case and unified the community against her. She was about to learn that terrorizing your neighbors works fine until they stop being afraid and start getting angry. Deirdre's final meltdown began when she realized that criminal charges weren't just possible, they were inevitable. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had started making inquiries. The state attorney general's office was building a case, and her own attorney had basically fired her for being too toxic to represent. Her response was to attempt what I can only describe as a strategic retreat to Crazy Town. She tried to flee to her sister's house in Montana, apparently believing that crossing state lines would somehow make federal mail fraud charges disappear. Unfortunately for her master plan, the court had frozen her credit cards as part of the asset seizure, and her BMW broke down somewhere outside Denver. Nothing says criminal mastermind like getting stranded on I-25 because you can't afford a tow truck. When she slunk back to Willowbrook Estates 48 hours later, looking like she'd been living in her car, which she probably had, The neighbors were watching from windows like they were witnessing the world's least competent fugitive returning from a failed escape attempt. That's when she made her most desperate move yet, a direct bribery attempt that was so clumsy it would have made a mob movie extra cringe. She showed up at my door at 11 p.m. with a duffel bag containing $50,000 in cash, claiming it was restitution for any inconvenience I'd experienced. The woman actually used the phrase, "Let's put this unpleasantness behind us," while offering me a bag of money like some kind of suburban crime boss. What she didn't know was that I was wearing a wire for the FBI. Agent Martinez had suggested it after Deirdre's failed escape attempt, and apparently my property management background made me a natural for undercover work. The recording was beautiful. 47 minutes of Deirdre confessing to borrowing HOA funds, admitting to creating fake assessments, and explaining how she'd been creative with the accounting to fund her lifestyle. My personal favorite moment was when she said, "You understand how these communities work, right? The residents are sheep who need someone to make decisions for them. I was providing a service." The FBI agent listening through my earpiece probably broke a pencil from gripping it too hard. The attempted bribery added another felony to her collection, but more importantly, it gave us a confession that would make prosecution absolutely bulletproof. She'd just handed the federal government enough evidence to lock her up and throw away the key. Meanwhile, community solidarity had reached levels that would have made a union organizer weep with pride. 41 of 47 households were now openly supporting our rebellion, with only 6 holdouts, and those were all owned by Deirdre's relatives or people who owed her money. The community fund we'd established to help elderly residents with legal fees had grown to $12,000, mostly from small donations that proved our neighbors were willing to put their money where their principles were. The local restaurant owner donated catering for the upcoming meeting. The hardware store offered supplies for repairing vandalism damage. Even the mailman started reporting suspicious activity around coalition members' homes. Apparently, federal employees take mail tampering very seriously. National attention was building too. The HOA abuse organizations had discovered our story through social media, and suddenly we were getting support calls from communities dealing with similar corruption across the country. The hashtag #Millicent's was trending in property management circles, which isn't exactly mainstream fame but felt pretty good to those of us fighting suburban tyranny. Deirdre's professional life collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Her real estate brokerage terminated her contract immediately after the bribery attempt went public. The state licensing board suspended her pending investigation. Former clients started filing complaints about unethical behavior going back years. She filed for personal bankruptcy to hide assets, which only made the federal prosecutors more interested in where those assets might be hidden. The supreme irony was that her own house went into foreclosure. The woman who'd been threatening foreclosure against neighbors couldn't make her own mortgage payments once her criminal enterprise was exposed. Karma doesn't get much more poetic than that. Her last stand strategy was pure desperation theater. She planned to claim I was an outside agitator, sent to destroy the community, blame everything on the management company, and bring Chad plus 3 relatives as support to pack the meeting with allies. She even tried recruiting supporters from neighboring HOAs, promising them that outside interference in their communities could be next if they didn't stand together. But while she was scrambling to create the illusion of support, I was putting finishing touches on a presentation that would end her reign of terror permanently. The forensic accountant's report was crystal clear and visually devastating. The attorney's legal analysis identified 12 separate felonies with ironclad evidence. Bob's engineering assessment proved thousands wasted on imaginary infrastructure work. The private investigator's surveillance had caught ongoing financial crimes in real time. The night before the annual meeting, I visited Great Aunt Millicent's grave one final time. I told her about the evidence we'd gathered, the community we'd united, and the justice we were about to deliver. The August evening was warm and peaceful, fireflies beginning their nightly dance above the headstone. Tomorrow, Deirdre Pickering would face the reckoning that Great Aunt Millicent had started building years before her death, and I was going to make sure every second of it honored her memory. The community center on the morning of the annual meeting buzzed with the kind of electric tension you feel before a thunderstorm breaks. By 7 a.m., residents were already arriving with folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, settling in like they were claiming prime real estate for the neighborhood event of the decade. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with nervous energy and the faint scent of floor wax from the community center's overnight cleaning. 73 residents packed into a space designed for maybe 50, with local media crews setting up cameras in the back like they were covering a presidential debate instead of a suburban HOA meeting. Sarah Mitchell from the newspaper had her notebook ready, and the Denver TV affiliate had sent their investigative reporter. Apparently, HOA corruption was becoming primetime material. Deirdre arrived 20 minutes late in what could only be described as a tactical entrance, flanked by Chad and 3 relatives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. She'd clearly spent the morning trying to reclaim some semblance of authority, wearing a navy blazer that screamed, "I'm still in charge," and carrying a briefcase that probably contained more legal threats than actual legal authority. Her opening gambit was to immediately seize control of the meeting, citing procedural authority and board prerogatives, like some kind of suburban dictator reading from a constitutional monarchy handbook. She announced that the first order of business was removing me from the community for disruptive behavior and threatening community safety. That's when Gladys stood up like an avenging angel of parliamentary procedure. "Point of order," she called out in a voice that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. "Under Colorado state law and our own bylaws, this meeting must allow homeowner input before any business can be conducted. You cannot simply remove residents without due process." The room erupted in applause and shouts of support that made Deirdre's face cycle through more colors than a mood ring having an electrical malfunction. She tried to restore order by banging a gavel, which she didn't actually have authority to use, but the crowd was having none of it. I took the floor with the calm confidence that comes from having overwhelming evidence and nothing left to lose. I began with a tribute to Great Aunt Millicent, explaining how her love for this community had inspired her to spend her final years gathering evidence of corruption that would protect her neighbors from financial predation. The visual presentation hit like a guided missile. Financial charts showing the systematic theft of $447,000, before and after photos of promised improvements that existed only on inflated invoices, audio recordings of Deirdre admitting to creative accounting and calling residents sheep who need someone to make decisions for them. The audience reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Gasps of outrage when they realized the scope of the theft. Audible weeping from elderly residents who finally understood why they'd been targeted. Angry shouts when the racist undertones of Deirdre's enforcement patterns became clear. But the moment that defined everything came when Deirdre tried to interrupt the presentation. She jumped up screaming about lies and forgeries and conspiracy theories designed to destroy our community. Then she made the fatal mistake of playing the race card, suggesting that neighbors couldn't trust his kind to understand traditional community values. The room went dead silent for about 3 seconds, then exploded in unified outrage. These were people who had lived together for decades, who'd watched each other's kids grow up and supported each other through divorces and deaths and deployments. They knew exactly what Deirdre was suggesting, and they weren't having it. The smoking gun moment came when I played the audio recording from her bribery attempt. Her own voice, clear as a church bell, admitting to years of financial manipulation. I was providing a service by being creative with the accounting. These people don't understand how communities really work. Chad tried to claim the recording was illegal, but my attorney Jennifer Olivia was ready with chapter and verse of Colorado law, confirming single-party consent for recording conversations. Deirdre's face went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of grief in Fast Forward. Detective Williams from the Financial Crimes Unit had been observing from the back of the room and stepped forward to announce that formal charges were already being prepared. The FBI was reviewing evidence for federal prosecution. The state attorney general's office was pursuing civil penalties. Deirdre's real estate license was permanently revoked. The community vote was swift and merciless, unanimous removal of the entire board, with Deirdre and her allies walking out in defeat. Temporary leadership appointed with me as financial oversight chairman. Criminal prosecution approved by acclamation. Independent management company hired to prevent future corruption. As TV cameras captured Deirdre's final meltdown, screaming about conspiracies and lawsuits while Chad physically restrained her from attacking anyone, I delivered the line I'd been practicing for weeks. My great aunt taught me that communities are built on trust, not fear. Today, we reclaim our community. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes and felt like vindication for every elderly resident who'd been bullied, every family forced from their home, and every neighbor too afraid to speak up until now. Justice served at exactly room temperature in a community center that smelled like coffee and victory. 6 months later, the headlines told the whole story. Former HOA president sentenced to 4 years federal prison for embezzlement and mail fraud. Deirdre's guilty plea had come after her new attorney, a competent one this time, explained that fighting the evidence would be like arguing with gravity. Chad got 18 months as an accomplice, and her nephew's landscaping company folded after the IRS discovered some creative interpretations of tax law that made Deirdre's HOA accounting look amateur. The asset seizure recovered $312,000 through bank accounts, real estate holdings, and that ridiculous BMW that had become the unofficial symbol of suburban tyranny. We used the recovered funds to actually improve the community. Imagine that concept. The pool got professionally cleaned for the first time in years, looking like something you'd actually want to swim in instead of a breeding ground for mutant algae. Monthly HOA fees dropped from $180 to $95, proving that honest management costs significantly less than criminal enterprise overhead. The new playground we built with recovered funds became a symbol of what communities can accomplish when they work together instead of being terrorized by petty dictators. Kids who'd been cited for chalk drawings were now laughing on swings purchased with money their tormentor had tried to steal. Poetry in motion, if you ask me. Marcus Cleaning and Property Solutions, my new consulting business, took off faster than I'd expected. Turns out that communities across Colorado were dealing with similar corruption, and word spreads quickly in HOA circles when someone actually knows how to fight back legally. I specialized in forensic financial analysis and helping communities recover from board abuse. 23 clients in the first year with recovered funds totaling over $2 million. Not bad for a guy who'd been unemployed and homeless 6 months earlier. The ripple effects went national. Colorado passed Marcus's Law. Okay, they didn't actually name it after me, but everyone knew where the inspiration came from, requiring public financial audits for any HOA community over 25 homes. The legislation included whistleblower protections and criminal penalties for board members who misappropriate funds. Other states started introducing similar legislation because apparently suburban financial corruption was more widespread than anyone wanted to admit. Millicent's Garden became the heart of our transformed community. We converted the space next to the community center into a memorial garden with her favorite roses, plus a little library where neighbors could borrow tools and share gardening advice. The stray cats still got fed daily. Tradition is tradition. And the community fund we'd established provided scholarships for elderly residents facing financial hardship. Gladys appointed herself unofficial community historian, documenting our transformation from fear-based dictatorship to actual democracy. Sophia completed her paralegal certification and started a nonprofit organization helping HOA abuse victims across the region. Bob led the infrastructure committee with actual engineering expertise, ensuring that when we paid for improvements, we actually got improvements worth paying for. The second annual Millicent Day drew over 200 attendees, including families from neighboring communities who'd heard our story and wanted to see what positive change looked like. Local news covered the transformation, focusing on how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept abuse as normal. The documentary film crew that showed up last month was particularly interested in the legal strategy we'd used. Apparently, our case was becoming a template for HOA reform nationwide, studied in law schools and cited in court cases from California to Florida. Great Aunt Millicent would have gotten a kick out of knowing her evidence gathering was being taught to future lawyers. But the best part was walking through the neighborhood on summer evenings, seeing kids playing in yards without fear of violation notices, elderly residents tending gardens without harassment, and neighbors talking to each other instead of hiding behind curtains. The smell of barbecue replaced the stench of fear, and the sound of laughter echoed where there used to be whispered complaints. Property values increased 12%. Turns out that honest management and community trust are better for real estate prices than tyrannical enforcement of arbitrary rules. Who could have predicted that? Sometimes the system works, but only when good people stand up and make it work. My great aunt taught me that communities are worth fighting for, and that David can beat Goliath with the right slingshot, evidence, law, and community solidarity. So drop a comment about your HOA nightmare, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people fighting extraordinary corruption. Remember, you have more power than you think, but only if you're willing to use it. Next week's story. Karen tried to steal my parking spot. She had no idea I owned the entire block.
Thank you for tuning in to HOA Stories, where neighbors stand up against HOA Karens and karma comes a knocking.